very much for that very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here at an IFPRI seminar again. It's your associates of us, chapter one, and thank you all for coming too. This work is very appropriately being launched at IFPRI seminar because not only in the earlier part of the project on looking at agricultural distortions did we have some IFPRI representation, but in this particular book there's several chapters that have co-authors that are or were with IFPRI at the time they were writing. When we released the Global Overview book last October, what we showed there was that there had been a lot of reform in agricultural policies since the mid-80s. That got worse up until then, but then got better after the mid-80s. But that nonetheless, there was still a great deal of distortion left in agricultural markets around the world. And some modelling work in the last chapter of that book suggested that we'd only come a little bit over halfway towards liberalising goods markets globally by 2004, and that the remaining policies that were still in place as of that time were favouring farmers in high-income countries at the expense of farmers in developing countries, and overall agricultural distortions were responsible for 70-odd% of the global cost of goods market distortions around the world. So there's still a lot of distortions there, and the question we were asking is how are those impacting on poverty and inequality? This graph simply summarises those global results. The upper line is the rich country nominal rates of assistance to farmers, which grew through to the mid-80s and have roughly halved since then, although less so if you take into account some of the measures, which is shown in the dashed line. But the lower line is the developing country line, and as you can see, in those early decades of independence of many of those developing countries, the average rate of assistance was of the order of minus 25%. Farmers were only getting 3/4 of what they would get under free markets. But that has mainly disappeared since then. In fact, it's positive. So this middle dashed line is that same line for developing countries, but when you subdivide distortions as between exporting industries and import competing farm industries in those developing countries, the lower line here is the exporting part of agriculture. You can see there's been a lot of export taxation there in previous decades, and that's virtually disappeared by the beginning of this decade. But the upper line is the protection to import competing agriculture, which has been alive and well throughout this period of the last half century, and even growing somewhat over time. So this is a rough summary of the distortions that are currently in place in those developing countries. So this new book was aimed at trying to understand the extent to which those existing policies as of 2004, which is the latest year for which we have data for the world as a whole in our global models, to what extent are those distortions impacting on poverty and inequality across countries and within countries. And of course this is important for the Doha negotiations underway at the WTO, or ought to be underway, because it has been one of the contentious issues. India, for example, saying that poverty would be increased if they were forced to liberalise their agricultural markets. It's also important for, as Justin said, the Millennium Development Goals, where poverty is one of the major goals being sought by 2015. In addition to that, of course, there's a lot of money now being thrown at agriculture, at agricultural development. Since the G8 meetings, for example, last July, this is pledged to spend another $20 billion on global agricultural and food security. And if that sort of money is being spent, and the World Bank itself has just set up a global agricultural and food security program, then you want to make sure that distortions aren't too bad in those countries in which that money is being spent, or it'll be spent on the wrong types of industries. Well, the answer to the question on poverty is not all that obvious. As Justin remarked, there are a number of reasons why it's not clear in any particular country setting whether poverty would be increased or decreased if you were to liberalise markets. And there's several reasons for that. One is that not all international food prices would rise if you liberalised global trade. It's true that many of them would, many farm product prices would rise, but not all of them. But also, many developing countries are, as you saw from that previous graph, protecting some of their agricultural industries. And so it's conceivable, if they were to open up their markets, that the prices of those products would actually fall, even though internationally the prices of the same products might rise. As well, the poor in developing countries include not only farmers, but also, of course, net buyers of food, and they would benefit from the removal of their own country import restrictions, but they could lose from export tax removal. Argentina's a case in point. Carolina's here, she did the Argentinian study. Also, of course, there are lots of farmers themselves who are net buyers of food because they're concentrating on cash cropping, for example. And finally, and Justin again mentioned this, the importance of the indirect effects of reforms need to be taken into account. One of those is what happens to government taxes if you alter the tax regime. If you eliminate export taxes or import taxes, for example, government revenue goes down. How does the government compensate? We model in these models that we'll describe in a minute various ways in which the government might compensate, and obviously is going to have an impact on net incomes of various household types according to how you do that tax adjustment. But in addition, there are lots of distortions in labour markets, for example, and if they were altered at the same time, you'll get different outcomes. And the China study is a good one in this book, for example, that points to that. So the approach in this book is to use, as Justin said, global and national economy-wide models, simulation models that aim to get beyond just talking about national welfare as an aggregate, but also get to the point of looking at different types of households. So we have three global models represented in this book, in the first three chapters. The linkage model is the one that the workhorse model in the World Bank used for projecting the world economy, for example. So that's our workhorse one in this book as well. There's also something called GIDD, which is the Global Integrated Distribution Database, and it's based on a whole lot of household survey data, as you'll see in a minute. And the third one is the standard GTAP database and model that you're familiar with, perhaps. So in addition to those global models, we have 10 national models covering the three main regions. They look at the effect of national policies on that national economy, but we also use the linkage model to get results on for each of those countries as to what the effects would be of liberalising the rest of the world policies, which will alter the terms of trade for each particular country. So Dominic and Mensbrugger did all these simulations, one at a time for each country where it liberalised for the rest of the world, and got those terms of trade effects for using in national models. And each of these national models has micro-simulation modules attached to show different types of households, earnings and spending. There's lots of common methodological elements. That was one of the features of the book, was to use a common framework throughout. They all have a 2004 database. They use our new agricultural distortion estimates that do include export taxes, not just the import tax data that are in the GTAP database, for example. And that turns out to be important for the Argentinian case, where there's very large export taxes in place, for example. They all simulate the removal of agricultural distortions without, as well as with, other goods reforms, so you get a sense of the relative importance of agricultural policies vis-a-vis other goods trade policies. And they also simulate own country versus rest of world reforms to get a sense of how important own country policies are to the picture for a particular country. None of them, though, are dynamic models. They're all comparative static models, and so they miss a lot of the growth dimension that could come from reforms. They were probably understating the welfare effects, possibly the poverty effects as well. Nor do they have scale economies or differentiated products, again, probably reducing significantly the welfare gains. So the global linkage model then, that's a model that has, it's a long-run model, has fairly high Armington elasticities in it. But in that model, the only sense in which there's a set of poverty numbers is through the use of a poverty elasticity related to income. It's done in a way that we looked at how do the incomes of people close to the poverty line change, net of changes in the price of the most important items in their budget, which are food and clothing. So these are the results quickly of that particular model. The bottom line down here, you can see that it's suggesting there'd be about a 3% decline in the number of people on $1 a day, the extreme poor, if you were to get rid of those goods market distortions globally. And for the regions shown there, all regions would gain in terms of poverty reduction except India. And India turns out to be an exception in many of these studies. But even despite that large country looking like it will get an increase in poverty potentially, nonetheless globally there is this reduction of 3%. There's some big reductions in East Asia, for example, and that's predominantly Vietnam and Thailand benefiting from freer trade, particularly in rice. This linkage model, nearly two-thirds of, or rather 2 times the welfare gain for developing countries would be nearly 2 times that for high-income countries. So in that sense, there's a reduction in international inequality in the very broad sense. And agricultural reforms are responsible for 70% of that gain, 72% I think of that gain for developing countries. And the agricultural value added in developing countries is boosted 3 times as much as non-agricultural value added. So if most of the poor are in agriculture, either directly or indirectly, depending on agriculture for their livelihood, that alone would suggest you might expect poverty to be reduced in developing countries. Well, the GIDD model is really, as I said, it's a set of, makes use of a set of household income and expenditure survey data to provide a very rich set of household information for 73 countries and developing countries and another 47 to some lesser extent. So there's huge numbers of households represented in this, and that model is run using the linkage model to get a sense of how markets would change in those individual developing countries, and then looks at the welfare effects of that and particularly the effects on the number of poor. So again, looking at the extreme number of poor, those on less than $1 a day, for this model also, South Asia and India in particular, comes up with numbers that suggest poverty would be increased slightly, but for all the other regions it's a decrease, and it turns out in the arithmetic of this particular model that the net effect would be slightly, an increase slightly in poverty, which is just another illustration of how sensitive these results can be to the specifications of the model with countries included and so on. And thirdly, the global GTAP model, which is more of a short to medium run model with lower Armington elasticities. It uses, for example, that each of these models has some revenue replacement assumption. This particular one is to use a uniform income tax across countries across households to get a replacement of trade tax revenue that would disappear with liberalisation. But this particular version of the GTAP model has 15 countries, developing countries, with household data on there, so we can look at those 15 in some greater detail to see how poverty is impacted. And importantly here, it's not just what happens on the expenditure side, as in all these models, it's also what matters, and often happens to matter more than what happens on the expenditure side, is what happens on the income earning side. So factor incomes are very important for households near the poverty line. So here's the results. In all of these models, we separate ag from non-ag liberalisation. So the first column here shows you the agriculture-only liberalisation results. And you can see that for these 15 developing countries, the weighted average is just under 2% reduction in the number of poor, with again East Asia being an important area where this happens a lot. And the second column is the standard tax replacement results. And the third column is the all goods liberalisation, but with the poor being exempt from the income tax that would be imposed to raise revenue for replacing the trade taxes that were lost. And what you can see by comparing columns 2 and 3 is that it makes a very big difference how you assume that revenue is going to be replaced. If the poor are exempt, and the very poor in most countries are exempt from income taxes, then there's a much bigger reduction in poverty shown in that last column as compared with the second column. The other point you might notice as between the first and second column is that most of the impact of poverty reduction here is coming from agricultural reform. That when you add the other goods in there, it doesn't add that much more to the poverty reduction results. And then finally, turning to the modelling results, and Will Martin's going to follow me in a minute with a lot more detail of some of these examples, but that's our set of 10 countries in here, plus the authors. And let me just give you some regional summary averages, that are unweighted averages across the countries in each of those regions, to see what's going on here. So this, for example, is the results firstly for agricultural only liberalisation, and then in the second half for all goods liberalisation, showing the difference between unilateral and global liberalisation. So for if you look at the bottom line for all of these 9 developing countries, sorry, there's 10 countries in the set, but Argentina only had data for urban households, so we didn't get an aggregate for the overall economy there. For the bottom line here is suggesting that about half of the gains in terms of poverty reduction are coming from unilateral reform. Unilateral reform is not unimportant here, but it's also suggesting that reforms such as via Doha, by the rest of the world liberalising, can also add significantly to the poverty alleviation that such reforms could provide. But you'll notice that all of the signs there are negative for all of those regions, for all of those types of liberalisation. So suggesting that at least in terms of these regional averages, there is a very positive story, or a negative story in terms of poverty, a positive story in terms of alleviating poverty. As for inequality, there are results in there for urban versus rural. You can have a look at those, but here's just the overall results, again for agriculture on its own and for all goods liberalisation. And again, the signs here are almost all negative, suggesting that inequality is reduced as a consequence of these reforms. And again, if you look at the bottom line, about half of the inequality reduction comes from own reform and about half from the rest of the world. So to sum up then, it does suggest from these case studies, global as well as national, that trade liberalisation would have a positive impact on both alleviating poverty and reducing inequality. There are some important exceptions, like India in these models. We need to look more carefully at what's going on in those Indian models to see why that is the case. But the benefits are usually at least as strong from own trade reform, but if you get global reform at the same time, or rest of the world reform at the same time, that can roughly double the impact for any particular country group. And much of the benefit is coming from agriculture. Most of the benefit in lots of these results. And finally, I'd stress this point again, that what matters here does depend heavily on what happens domestically to other policies, not just to the trade policies themselves. So if there were to be accompanying reforms to domestic market distortions, such as in the labour market, in the case of the China case study that Will will mention in a minute, that can add enormously to the benefits from this reform at the border. And again, the way in which tax is handled also can have a big impact on the extent to which countries can alleviate poverty. Good. I think I should leave it there, and then we'll have a go at looking at some more specific country detail.